In this session, I'm going to show you a few different ways to visualize or graph data. This is a really important step in the data analysis process. Some people jump right to statistics, but you can really run the risk of misinterpreting the statistics if you don't have a good feel for the data. So what we want to do is inspect the data visually. And the other thing that we can do while we're doing this is save some of the output from the various steps we're going to go through and use those in our report. Because just as important as analyzing the data is really communicating what we found, and doing that graphically complemented by the statistics is really the full package. So the first thing we're going to do is open up the data file, and so just navigate to wherever it is that you've saved the data file that you're going to work on. In this case, I'm going to pull up the same rent data that we've been working on in prior sessions. Alright, so here's our data in our variable view, and the first thing we're going to do is do some descriptive statistics. One of the easiest ways to do that is under this Analyze tab. If you go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and there are a few different ones that we'll use here over the next few sessions, but right now I'm just going to look at frequencies. And for this particular example, I'm going to use our rent data and select that variable. You could put a few different variables in there and analyze them or graph them simultaneously, but just to keep it simple, we'll focus on rent for now. So the next thing I need to do is actually pick the statistics that I want for it to compute. So under statistics, a lot of different things you could think about. Here are the various measures of central tendency. I'm interested in the mean, the median, and the mode. You could look at quartiles, percentiles, and so forth. And these are measures of dispersion, or the spread of the responses. And we can think about that in a few different ways. We can think about range, variance, and so forth. I'm going to pick standard deviation. So after picking the statistics, now we need to tell it what sort of charts we're interested in. Depends on the type of data. In this case, I'm just going to pick a histogram. You see right here, we've got a check. That was the default under display frequency tables. We don't really need a frequency table in this case, but I'm going to leave that there just to show you what happens. So once I've made my selections for statistics and charts, I'll click OK. So this is one of those times where we actually do want to look at our output file. We don't care about the software code that was written up here. But here's where we see the output from the different options that we selected. So first, look at statistics. So how much are folks paying for rent in Williamsburg? And remember, in the survey, this was not by room. This was overall. So in other words, it could be the rent for an apartment, for a house, and so forth, which is why you see the rent figure is pretty steep. About $1,200 a month. At least that was the mean. The median was $800. The most common was $750, or the mode. This right here is the frequency table. It's showing all the individual values that were entered, the frequency of occurrence of those values, and the percentage that that response represents within the entire data set. But again, we don't really care as much about this frequency table. What we want to see is a summary, in this case, as a histogram. So here's a histogram of rent from the data. You see we've got our measures of central tendency that were telling us that it was around $1,000 or so, depending on what measure you're looking at. So this is an interesting graph, and you may want to actually export this into Word or PowerPoint and use it in a presentation. Before we do that, however, maybe you want to make some changes. And there are a lot of different changes you could make. To make changes in the graph, double-click on it. And we won't go through many here. I just want to illustrate this. So for example, I could click on the title and maybe make that more informative. Then I could take some of these summary statistics right here, maybe drag that into the graph itself. A lot of other changes you could explore. You could switch the x and y axes. You could change the range along the x-axis or the y-axis. You could play around with colors and so forth. But you get the point. So I'm going to close out of this, and you see that my changes were saved. And now I can right-click, copy this graph. And in this case, let's say that for now anyway, I want to save it into PowerPoint. So I can just paste it into PowerPoint, and that can just be an ongoing collection of different graphs that eventually I include in a report. So that was one way to visualize. Data. Now I'm going to show you another way. These next couple options are a little bit more powerful. What I'm going to do is go to the Graphs tab, and the first one I'm going to pick on is Graphs Graph Board Template Chooser. Now with this option, what you do is identify the variables that you're interested in visualizing. And then what SPSS is going to do is, based on the type of data, which I've already specified here, it's going to propose a few different graphs that make sense given that type of data. So let's say I'm interested in graphing the data from this variable decor1. So I've highlighted that, and here are a few different graph options that it's proposing. So I can simply click on the one I'm interested in, click OK, and it provides the data. Same as before, I can double click on this graph, I can add titles, change colors, etc., and then copy and paste it into another program. So that's another way to visualize data when you have one variable. Here's where it gets a bit more interesting. Let's say that you've got two variables you want to graph simultaneously. In other words, you want to visually inspect the relationship between two variables. This is a really good thing to do before you explore correlations or regressions, which depend on the concept of correlation. For example, we have these 5 questions about decor, interior atmosphere, and we'd expect that they'd be correlated. So I want to highlight D1 and D2. And based on the fact that now I've highlighted 2 variables that happen to be scale variables, SPSS is proposing a few different graph types that might make sense. I'm going to pick the bin scatter plot. So here's what the data look like. Let me help you understand what we're looking at. So each of these circles represents a data point. So for example, somebody who rated decor 1 provided a rating of 1, provided a rating of 3 when they were asked the question related to decor 2. So that's that one dot there. The darker the circle, that means that there are a lot of dots overlaid there. So if you look carefully, when we simultaneously plot, think of these as just simply x and y data, the data from D1 and D2, what you see is a bit of a trend here, that there's a correlation, if you can almost visualize a line. So this would be a really good thing to do before running an actual statistical test to test for a correlation. Just inspect the data. Does it look like there's a correlation there? And then of course you can copy and paste that graph. And finally, here's the third way to visualize data. Again, we're going to use the Graphs tab. This time we're going to use Chart Builder. And Chart Builder's a little. And finally, here's the third way to visualize data. Again, we're going to use the Graphs tab. This time we're going to use Chart Builder. And Chart Builder's a little different. It sort of reverses the thought process. So before, we were picking variables, and then SPSS was recommending different graphs depending on the variable data type. This time instead we're going to start with the graph type. So if you have a graph that you have in mind, first we'll pick the graph, and then we'll pick the variables that we want to plot using that graph type. So let's say, for example, I'm interested in a bar chart. Well, there are a lot of different charts. Let's explore that a little bit. There are line charts, area charts, pie charts, and so forth. but for this example I'll use a bar chart. So I'm just going to pick my chart type. I want to do something simple here. I'm going to select this one, drag it into the workspace. Alright, so I've selected my graph type. The next thing I need to do is actually identify what data I want to use for my x-axis and for my y-axis. So let's say, for example, that I want to look at rent charged as a function of the dwelling type. So in other words, how much rent are you paying depending on whether you're in a room that's in a dorm, a condo, a house, and so forth. In other words, type is going to be my x-axis. So what I'm doing is drag my variable type, put it down here under x-axis. And now I need to decide what my y-axis is going to be. It's sort of defaulted and just put a count variable here, but really I want to use rent instead. So I'm going to take rent, drag it over into this area. And so there I have identified a bar chart is the graph, dwelling type is my x-axis, and mean rent is my y-axis. Go ahead and hit OK. And here's what I get. Now notice something here. Notice that I don't have the right labels. Instead it's just giving me the raw codes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. So let's close out of here and go back and see how we can do that again, but this time we actually want to have the right labels. So if I actually want to have the values identified properly, I first need to tell SPSS. So if I actually want to have the values identified properly, I first need to tell SPSS what each of those codes means. So for example, for type, right now I haven't told it what the different values represent. So I'm going to go back under Data, Define Variable Properties. I'm going to pick that type variable, and now it's going to show me once again the different values. And in a prior session we populated this. I'll show you again how to do it here. We'll call that dorm, apartment, house, condo, and other. But this is why it's important. So when we're doing graphs, we want to be able to actually see that information. So let's go back this time under Graphs, Chart Builder. Now it's left in here our choices before. Right, so we've got the bar type and mean rent. Click OK, and this time we get the correct labels. So we've seen 3 different ways to visualize data. I encourage you to do that for all of the variables in your analysis before you move forward with any statistics, which will be what we'll work on next.